The town of Stolberg sits in the coal and copper country of the Rhineland, about a dozen miles east of the Belgian border, between the Ind River and the low hills of the northern Eifel. Before the war, it was a working city. Copper smelters, zinc refineries, chemical works, a place of slag heaps and factory gates and narrow streets that climbed and dipped through the dark hills. The houses were brick. The churches were old. The people were the kind of people who had lived in the same valleys for generations, smelting or out of the earth the way their fathers had. By September of 1944, none of that remains intact. The factories are silent. The streets hold broken glass and brick dust. The walls of the buildings carry the signatures of artillery. What is left of civil life in Stolberg has gone underground, and the men moving through its streets after dark are soldiers, German and American, fighting over a city that neither side built and both sides want. In those streets, at one of the intersections the tactical maps have marked as critical, 3 squads from the 2nd Platoon of Company I, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, are holding a crossroads on the morning of September 24, 1944. The date matters. By late September, the Americans have been inside Germany for nearly 2 weeks, holding ground they carved through the great belt of concrete and steel that the Germans called the West Wall and the Allies called the Siegfried Line. The crossroads that the 2nd Platoon is defending sits behind that line, in the Stolberg corridor, in a town the 1st Division has fought for and taken and is now trying to keep. The Germans want it back. 2 full companies of German infantry, supported by machine guns, are already moving through the pre-dawn dark when the men of the 2nd Platoon begin to understand how many are coming. They come before the sun does. The assault falls on all 3 American positions at once. One squad cannot hold against the weight of fire and the flanking pressure. It falls back. Another squad has no time to fall back at all. The Germans close on it fast, from multiple directions, and the men are taken prisoner, marched away from the intersection at gunpoint into the German-controlled part of Stolberg. In a few minutes of combat in the dark, 2 of the 3 squads are gone. Now only 1 squad remains at the crossroads. Staff Sergeant Joseph Edward Schaefer has watched this happen. He is a staff sergeant from Queens, New York, who has been at war since the landings in North Africa in November of 1942, and by this early morning in September of 1944, he has developed the kind of understanding that 2 years of consecutive combat produces, a clear sense of what a moment like this requires. What it requires is someone to stay. He moves his remaining men under fire into a nearby house that will give them walls between their bodies and the German weapons, crawls under fire to reach each individual and place him, selects his own position with the same logic that governs everything else he does on this morning, and takes the door. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The story the channel title offers uses the figure of 22. The actual Medal of Honor citation, which is the primary document and the one that governs everything this script says, does not use that number. It says 10 German prisoners captured by Schaefer alone, 15 to 20 Germans killed by the same man with the same rifle, and an unspecified number of American prisoners liberated before the morning ended. Whether the arithmetic of 10 Germans marched out under guard, plus approximately 12 Americans freed from German hands, adds to something close to 22 is a fair question. What the title gives you is a reasonable summation of what the record documents. The record itself will be more precise, and the record is where we stay. Before we follow that sergeant to the door of a house in Stolberg, we need to understand the ground he was standing on and the road that brought the 1st Infantry Division to Germany in the first place. Because nothing that happened at that crossroads makes sense without it. The West Wall ran for more than 300 miles along Germany's western border, from the border of the Netherlands in the north to the Swiss frontier in the south. The Germans began building it in 1936 and continued adding to it through the early war years. More than 3,000 concrete bunkers, some with walls reinforced to 6 feet of thickness, set into the hillsides and the tree lines with fields of fire calculated to cover every approach. Dragon's teeth, rows of truncated concrete pyramids, squat and angled, built at the height of a tank's tracks to channel armor into killing grounds where anti-tank guns waited. Minefields laid by engineers who knew exactly where the gaps were. Machine gun positions sited to put interlocking fire across every road and trail. The whole structure was built on the principle that no single point needed to be impregnable if every point was mutually supporting. You could not go through one bunker without being fired on by three others. For most of the spring and summer of 1944, getting to the West Wall at all was the Allied problem. After D-Day and the Great Breakout from Normandy in August, the Allied armies moved so fast across France and Belgium that their supply lines stretched past breaking. The Allies outran their fuel and their ammunition, and the forward division slowed just as they reached the German border. The pause gave Germany exactly what it needed: time to man the West Wall with units rushed from the interior. By early September, when the 1st Infantry Division began its assault on the line in the Aachen Forest, the bunkers were manned and the Dragon's Teeth were watched by crews with automatic weapons. The 18th Infantry Regiment, Schaefer's regiment, fought through the West Wall bunker line in the second week of September 1944, working through the Aachen Forest position by position, using bazookas and Bangalore torpedoes and tank guns to clear the concrete strongpoints one at a time. By the third week of September, the regiment had pushed several miles into Germany and was holding the Stolberg corridor. The town itself had fallen. Holding it against the counterattacks that the Germans launched to recover the ground they had lost was a different kind of fight, and it was what Company I was doing at the Crossroads on the morning of September 24th. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had not arrived at Stolberg fresh. The men who held that crossroads had been at war continuously since the landings in North Africa at Oran in November of 1942. They had fought through Tunisia and into Sicily and had earned the kind of reputation that comes from being used first and hardest wherever the fighting was worst. The Big Red One was the Army's oldest division, its shoulder patch a simple red numeral 1 on a khaki field, and it had already fought one world war before this one. What that history meant to the men carrying the patch in 1944 is difficult to quantify, but it is worth noting that by September of that year the 1st Division had been in combat so long that replacement soldiers coming into the division were often treated as untested men by veterans who had been through Africa and Sicily and Normandy, regardless of what training the replacements had received. This is what it means to be in a division that has been fighting for nearly 2 years. The baseline rises, and the men who meet it are not the same men who enlisted in 1942. On June 6, 1944, the 18th Infantry had landed in the second wave on Omaha Beach, going in through the same surf and smoke and German fire that had already killed hundreds of Americans in the first wave. They reached the seawall. They climbed it. They pushed inland through the Norman hedgerows through June and July, fighting in the bocage country where every hedgerow was a fortification and every field was a potential kill zone. In August, they were racing east across France with Patton's breakout. In September, they were inside Germany, and the accumulated weight of 2 years of consecutive combat sat on every man in Company I, whether he named it or not. The division had no freshmen left. It had veterans, which is different and worse, and sometimes better. Joseph Edward Schaefer was born on December 27, 1918, in Queens, New York. He grew up in Richmond Hill, a neighborhood of brick houses and tree-lined streets in the working-class interior of the borough, away from the water and the elevated trains of the more famous Queens neighborhoods. He enlisted in the Army from Long Island in January of 1942, 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and was assigned to the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division. He was 23 years old when he joined. The public record does not preserve much about who he was before the Army, whether he worked a trade, what he read, who he loved. What the record preserves is what he became. By September of 1944, he was a staff sergeant, which in a rifle company of the American Army is a precise and demanding role. He led a squad of roughly 10 to 12 men in close combat. He answered to the platoon leader but acted, in the moment of contact, on his own authority. He knew his men the way soldiers know the men they have lived beside in foxholes and eaten beside in the dirt and pulled off the wire beside in the dark, completely and without illusion. He had 2 silver stars by the time he reached Germany, each representing an act of valor the Army had judged above the ordinary standard. He had been wounded at least twice and gone back. 3 Purple Hearts would eventually find him, spaced across the years and campaigns, which tells you something about the specific places he chose to be when the fighting was happening. The 3 silver stars and the 3 wounds and the 26 months of war by September 1944 form a portrait of a man who had been tested past what most men are ever tested. Not in one great hour, but in the sustained and grinding and unromantic way that infantry combat actually works. The cold foxholes, the failed advances, the men who do not come back from the night patrol, the wounds that heal and leave their scar and then send you back to the same front where you got them. This is the man who chose the doorway. It is worth spending a moment on what the record actually shows and what the channel title simplifies, because the 0-hour standard is the record and not the title. The title of this episode says the Germans captured his entire squad. The Medal of Honor citation says something different. On September 24, 1944, it was not Schaefer's squad that was captured. It was another squad in his platoon, one of the 3 squads positioned at the Crossroads, that was overwhelmed and taken prisoner. Schaefer's squad was the one that held. The citation is specific about this. One American squad was forced back, another captured, leaving only S/Sergeant Schaefer's men to defend the position. The title uses the language of high drama, which is channel voice and not inaccurate in the emotional sense. In the plainest sense of the record, the distinction is important. The men who were taken prisoner were not Schaefer's squad members. They were his platoon brothers, neighboring soldiers in the same fight, and the difference between his squad and a squad in his platoon is the kind of difference that the record demands we keep. The broader myth worth correcting here is the one that surrounded the Western Front in September 1944, the belief, widespread in the Allied command and in the American public, that Germany was effectively beaten. After the Great Rout across France in August, after the extraordinary acceleration of the Allied advance that had covered in weeks the ground that planners had expected to take months, the prevailing assessment was that the Wehrmacht was finished in the West, that the West Wall would fold quickly, that the war might be over by Christmas. Field Marshal Montgomery's failed airborne operation at Arnhem in September, Operation Market Garden, was partly the product of this optimism. The intelligence that fed it was selective, and the expectation was wrong. The men holding ground in Stolberg in late September knew it was wrong. The 2 companies of German infantry that hit the 2nd platoon before dawn on September 24th were not the remnants of a broken army. They were organized soldiers, equipped and supported, fighting a coherent counterattack against a position the Americans had taken from them. The gap between what the headlines were saying in September 1944 and what the staff sergeants in the Rhineland were doing, holding Crossroads under company-strength assault, was wide. It has stayed wide. The battles for the West Wall and the Rhineland towns from September through November of 1944, the hard grinding fight that preceded the Battle of the Bulge and made it possible for Germany to mass the forces it did in December, have never received the popular attention that the more famous engagements carry. Stolberg is not Bastogne. The men of Company I are not as widely known as the men of the 101st Airborne. This episode exists, in part, because that gap should be smaller. The morning of September 24th arrives cold in the Rhineland, the way September mornings do in the German hills. A damp chill out of the overcast sky, the days already shortened, the trees along the edges of the streets still in their last summer leaves, but already losing the argument with autumn. The 2nd platoon has been at the Crossroads long enough to know the approaches. 3 squads, covering 3 angles, a defense in-depth arrangement of the kind that infantry platoons build instinctively when they know a position needs to hold. The house at the corner is a standard Rhineland residential building. Brick walls a foot thick, a solid front door, windows that look out over the intersection in 2 directions. Schaefer's squad is positioned in or near it. What happens before dawn is exactly what a well-led assault against a known position looks like. The Germans have identified the 3 American strongpoints. They hit them simultaneously with a force that outnumbers the defenders by a factor of several to 1, and they hit them with machine gun support that pins the flanks and prevents mutual reinforcement. 1 squad folds under the pressure. The 3rd one goes quickly. The Germans close before the Americans can consolidate, and the prisoners are moved rearward at gunpoint before the squad leader can do anything about it. Now Schaefer has his squad, a house, and maybe 10 minutes before the Germans redirect their attention to the 1 remaining American position at the intersection. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He moves the squad under fire, crawling from man to man in the open, instructing each one on where to go or to position himself inside the house. He does this under small arms and machine gun fire that is already working the ground around the crossroads. The citation notes this specifically. He crawled about under heavy small arms and machine gun fire to instruct each individual and move them into the building. He does not stand up and wave them forward. He goes to each man. When a heavy concentration of enemy artillery hits the building itself, the walls absorb it and the men hold their positions. Schaefer takes the door. The M1 Garand that he carries is an 8-shot semi-automatic rifle chambered in 30-06. The round it fires is large and accurate at the ranges that matter in town fighting, and the rifle operates fast enough that a skilled shooter can put 8 shots on target in under 15 seconds, strip the empty in-block clip when it pings out automatically, and be loaded and firing again in moments. Schaefer has been carrying this weapon since North Africa. He knows it the way a craftsman knows the tool he uses every day. The first wave of German infantry crosses toward the house. The citation says he breaks it. With his M1 positioned at the door, he meets the first assault and drives it back. The word broke is the citation's, and it is precise. Not repelled, not slowed. Broke. The first wave does not reach the building. The Germans reorganize and come again. This time they add grenades and flamethrowers. The flamethrower is the tool that infantry units bring when a building is defended and rifle fire has not worked. A stream of burning fuel pushed through a window or a doorway that sets fire to everything it touches, that forces men out of cover or burns them inside it. The distinctive sound of a flamethrower in operation, a pressurized roar that rises before the fire appears, is the kind of sound that infantry veterans remember for the rest of their lives, because there is only one thing it means, and every man in the house knows what it is. Schaefer and his men push the second attack back as well, Schaefer accounting for several of the attackers himself. The house holds. What a house fight in a Rhineland brick building sounds and smells like in the middle of a combat engagement is something the citation does not describe, because citations do not describe such things. What the infantry soldiers who survived them did record, in the memoirs and letters and interviews collected after the war, is the particular compression of fighting inside walls, the acoustics that turn every rifle shot into something that rings through the skull, the smoke that collects at the ceiling and drops visibility to yards, the awareness of exits and angles, and which part of the floor a grenade will reach if it comes through the nearest window. The men at the windows had been there through 2 assaults. The dust from the earlier German artillery would have settled into every surface. The smell of burned propellant would have layered over the cold morning air. The particular pressure of knowing that 2 of the 3 positions at the crossroads had already gone under, that the men at those positions were dead or prisoners, and that the house was all that remained of the American defense of this intersection. That pressure was not described in the citation, but it was in the room. The men at the windows did not leave them. They held their positions. The word several in the citation covers what happens to the Germans who press close enough to threaten the door, which is that Schaefer kills or wounds them. The citation does not linger here. It moves forward. After the second attack fails, the German force, which still substantially outnumbers the Americans at the house, regroups again. The third assault is different. They divide. One group comes directly at the house from the front, the expected direction, the door that Schaefer has been holding for 2 attacks already. A second group moves quietly along a hedgerow that runs along one side of the property, working to come at the position from the flank or the rear to catch the defenders between 2 fires. It is a textbook flanking movement, the kind that kills soldiers who have been focused on the frontal threat and do not see the side approach until it is inside their perimeter. Schaefer sees it. The citation is specific about what he does next, and the specificity matters because it does not soften it into something more comfortable. He fires at the group coming from the front, killing or wounding all 6 of them. Then, with no cover available to him, none at all, he leaves the doorway and runs at the hedgerow. Not toward it, under cover of concealment or the building's angle. He runs across the open ground, under fire from the flanking group, with no protection between his body and their weapons except the speed he generates and the shock of the attack itself. He reaches the hedgerow and delivers what the citation calls deadly accurate shots, killing 5 of the flanking group, wounding 2 more, driving the rest back. Read that again. He is in the open. They are armed. They are firing at him. He kills 5 and wounds 2 and drives the rest away. The flanking assault collapses. Both German elements have failed. The house at the crossroads still belongs to the 2nd platoon, to the one remaining squad, to the man at the door who refused to give it up. After the 3rd attack, Schaefer searches the area around the house. In the litter of a firefight, in the places where soldiers go to ground after an assault fails, he finds German soldiers. Some have taken cover behind debris. Some are trapped between the American position and their own lines. He moves through the ground around the crossroads, armed with his rifle and the authority of a man who has just beaten back 3 attacks by himself, and he takes them prisoner. One by one, or in small groups, he disarms them and moves them into custody. The final count, as the citation records it, is 10. 10 German soldiers captured by one man, with a rifle, after holding a house alone against 2 companies. It is at this point that Company I begins its counterattack. The rest of the company has been pushing forward, and by the time Schaefer has finished collecting prisoners, the Americans are moving to retake the ground the Germans seized in the pre-dawn assault. Schaefer does not wait for the counterattack to pass him. He moves with it, in the lead of it, running and crawling through fire that is still active and still dangerous, toward the part of Stolberg where the captured squad had been taken. The citation uses a phrase worth noting, remaining in the lead. He is not following the counterattack through cleared ground. He is ahead of it, moving into ground that is still contested, in a fight that is still ongoing. He overtakes the German soldiers who had taken the squad. He finds the Americans. What that moment looked like, the reunion of a captured squad with the sergeant who came through the German lines to reach them, the record does not say. The citation does not name the liberated men or tell us how many they were, only that they were a squad, that they were captured earlier in the battle, and that Schaefer liberated them. Liberated is the citation's word, not rescued, not found. Liberated, the transitive verb that requires both the one doing it and the ones being done for. Consider, for a moment, what the morning had been for the men who were taken prisoner at the crossroads, captured in the dark, before dawn, in a fight that was over quickly once the German force closed on them. Marched through German-controlled streets in the occupied part of Stolberg, at gunpoint, into a situation where the outcome was uncertain and the war was still happening around them. They knew their platoon had been defending the crossroads. They did not know what had happened to Schaefer's squad. In the compressed chaos of a pre-dawn engagement, they could not have known whether anyone was left at the position or whether the German breakthrough had succeeded. And then, before the morning ended, through the fire of an ongoing counterattack, the staff sergeant from their platoon appears, coming to them through ground that was still contested. Leading. The citation records what came before and after that moment in precise terms. It does not record what was said or thought when the freed men saw him coming. The record is silent there, and the silence is where the imagination has permission to rest. The total account of what Schaefer did. On September 24, 1944, as the citation records it, single-handed and armed only with an M1 rifle, he killed between 15 and 20 German soldiers, wounded at least as many more, captured 10 prisoners, and freed the American soldiers who had been taken prisoner at the crossroads. He did this after holding a house against 2 companies with his squad, repelling 3 separate assaults, including a flanking attack he countered by running into the open at armed men. The crossroads held. That is what all of it produced. The German breakthrough did not come. What a stopped breakthrough meant in the military geography of the Rhineland in September 1944 is worth a moment's consideration. The German counterattacks around Stolberg that morning were not random. They were part of a systematic German effort to use the Westwall terrain and the industrial towns east of Aachen to stabilize a front line, to absorb the Allied advance and bleed the American divisions until the larger German counteroffensive in the winter, which would become the Battle of the Bulge, could be prepared and launched. Every American squad that held ground under German assault in September and October 1944 was part of the reason that the German defensive plan around Aachen eventually collapsed, and the Allies were able to concentrate on taking the city itself. The crossroads in Stolberg was one piece of a far larger effort. But pieces of that kind, held by squads of that kind, are how large efforts resolve at the scale where it actually matters. The larger fight continued for weeks. The 1st Infantry Division laid siege to Aachen through October, and on October 21, 1944, the the city surrendered to American forces, the first German city captured by the Allies, after days of block-by-block fighting that cost both sides heavily. The 18th Infantry received a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Aachen in early October. The regiment that Schaefer served in was at the center of the largest urban battle of the Rhineland campaign, and the ground they had held in Stolberg in late September was part of what made the approach to Aachen possible. Schaefer received his Medal of Honor on August 22, 1945, 3 months after Germany's surrender, in a ceremony conducted by Major General Walter M. Robertson in occupied Germany. The citation was issued under General Order 71. President Truman's acknowledgement, eventually carved into the memorial stone in Queens, read, "Schaefer's indomitable courage and his determination were responsible for stopping an enemy breakthrough." The decorations that accumulated over his service, 2 silver stars, each for earlier acts of valor, a bronze star, 3 purple hearts, 3 separate wounds from a war he entered in North Africa and did not leave until Germany was finished, the Legion of Merit, the French Croix de Guerre, awarded by a government that understood it had been defended in part by men like this one. He came home to Richmond Hill. He served again in Korea, which tells you what kind of man he was, the kind for whom soldiering was a continuation of something rather than an interruption. After Korea, he came back to the same neighborhood in Queens, where he spent most of the rest of his life. He died on March 16, 1987, at 68 years old, in the same part of the city he had grown up in. He was buried at Long Island National Cemetery in Farmingdale, a few miles from where he enlisted. The Sergeant Joseph E. Schaefer Oval was dedicated in Forest Park in Queens in the spring of 1987, only weeks after his death. It sits in the borough he grew up in and never permanently left. It is not a famous memorial. The people who know it are mostly the people who live near it, the people of Richmond Hill who pass through the park. That is how most of the men who held Crossroads in September 1944 are remembered, at the local level, by the people closest to them, through the kind of care that neighborhoods give to their own. There are things worth saying about the Rhineland campaign that popular memory of the European War does not often say. The great narrative of the American War in Europe runs from D-Day through the liberation of Paris in August 1944 and then jumps to the Battle of the Bulge in December, as if the months between were a footnote. They were not. September through November 1944 was the period in which American infantry divisions fought their way through the West Wall and the German border towns, took brutal casualties in the Hurtgen Forest, and held the line against German counterattacks that were deliberately bleeding them in preparation for the Ardennes offensive in December. The Hurtgen Forest alone, a stretch of dense German woodland 15 miles long and 10 miles wide between Aachen and the Rohr River, consumed American divisions over the fall of 1944 in fighting that veterans compared to the worst of the First World War. Men died in those trees for ground that amounted to yards. The 1st Infantry Division fought continuously from June 6, 1944, to the end of the war in Europe, almost 11 months without a true rest, and the men of Company I were in the center of it for all of it. The men who held Crossroads and Stolberg in late September 1944 did not make the famous films. Their battles did not produce the iconic photographs. The Rhineland in autumn is not Normandy in June, and the names attached to it, Stolberg, the Hurtgen Forest, Crucifix Hill, do not carry the same weight in public memory as the names Omaha Beach or Bastogne, though the men who fought there were as real and the dying was as permanent. What the record shows about Schaefer and his squad at the Crossroads in Stolberg is a story that belongs in the same breath as the more famous acts. The ground was real. The men were real. The dying was permanent. The question of the 22, which the title raises, resolves simply. The citation accounts for 10 German prisoners Schaefer took himself, and for the liberation of the captured American squad, whose head count the record leaves unspecified. A standard rifle squad in the American Army of 1944 carried somewhere between 9 and 12 men. 10 German prisoners and 12 freed Americans is 22. If that arithmetic is what the title intends, it is defensible from the record. If it is a simplification or a rounding of the killed and captured combined, the citation supports it in the general sense without endorsing the specific number. What the title does not manufacture is the fact that one man, at one crossroads, came back through German lines and brought people with him. That part the record confirms. There is a name that deserves to be said clearly. Joseph Edward Schaefer. Born December 27, 1918, in Queens, New York. Died March 16, 1987, in the same borough, in the neighborhood he came from. Staff Sergeant, Company I, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, United States Army. North Africa. Sicily. Omaha Beach. The Norman Bocage. The race across France. The West Wall. The Crossroads at Stolberg, Germany, September 24, 1944, where he held the door. His name belongs alongside the men of his squad. The soldiers he crawled under fire to position. The men who followed him to the windows and held them. The men who did not break when 2 of the 3 squads were gone and the Germans kept coming. The record does not give us their names individually. It gives us what they did. They stayed. His courage was singular. Their courage made it mean something. And alongside them, the men of the captured squad. The citation calls them simply that, the American squad captured earlier in the battle. They were someone's squad members, someone's brothers in the specific way that infantry soldiers become brothers, the way that has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the shared weight of the same foxhole in the same cold. Their names are not in the citation. They are there in the record only as the thing that was taken and then recovered. But they came home because a sergeant from Queens ran through the German lines to get them, and that deserves to be said plainly and carried forward. For all of them, Stolberg held. The Crossroads held. Remember who held it. The 2 German companies that crossed toward the Crossroads before dawn on September 24, 1944, were not the defeated remnants of an army in final collapse. Understanding who they were matters, both for accuracy and for what it tells us about the scale of what Schaefer held against, and because the record of the Second World War asks us, always, to see every soldier in it as a person before we see him as a symbol. By late September 1944, the German forces holding the Rhineland sector east of Aachen were fighting under a specific and calculated set of orders. The German High Command had accepted that the West Wall could not be held indefinitely, but it had also determined that every week of delay bought time for the larger Ardennes counteroffensive being planned in secret. The counterattacks that German units launched in September and October 1944 against American positions in the Stolberg corridor were not improvised. They were deliberate actions, designed to retake ground and force the Americans to fight for every building, every block, every crossroads in a city that the Germans had built and knew. The tactical logic was sound. 2 full companies against a single platoon position is a ratio that should, by any reasonable calculation, produce a German success. The men executing that plan were soldiers in the Wehrmacht's regular infantry, conscripts and professionals mixed, fighting on the soil of their own country for the first time in the war's Western theater. There is a particular quality to that experience that the historical record preserves in German memoirs and letters. The awareness that retreat now meant retreat into Germany itself, that the towns being fought over were German towns, that the civilians in the basements of the houses being shelled were German civilians. For many of the soldiers in the Stolberg sector in September 1944, this was both the most frightening and the most clarifying moment of the war. They were not fighting for territory in France or Russia or North Africa anymore. They were fighting for the house at the end of the road. The 12th Infantry Division, which operated in the Stolberg area during this period, had been at war since the invasion of Poland in 1939. The soldiers it put into the Rhineland in the fall of 1944 had accumulated years of experience on multiple fronts. They used their machine gun support at the Crossroads correctly. They attacked simultaneously to prevent mutual reinforcement between the American squads. When one approach failed, they adapted, brought different weapons, tried a flanking movement that was tactically sound. The flanking attack on the house failed because Schaefer crossed the open ground faster than the flankers expected and shot more accurately than most men could under those conditions. The German soldiers executing that attack were not cowards who flinched. They were fighting men who encountered something they could not overcome. Holding both of those things at once is what honest military history requires. The humanity of the men who came and failed, and the full account of the man who made them fail. The families those German soldiers came from, the towns in the Rhineland and Bavaria and Prussia they had left years earlier, the letters they wrote and received, and the ones that stopped coming. None of that is less real because those men fought on the wrong side of a criminal regime. The ideology of the Nazi state and the crimes committed in its name are a separate accounting from the infantrymen moving through the dark under orders. Holding that distinction does not soften what the regime did. It only insists on seeing people as people, which the record asks of us, even when it is harder. The men who were taken prisoner at the Crossroads, marched through German-controlled streets at gunpoint, were not mistreated in the way that the war produced mistreatment in other theaters and in other hands. The German army in the West in the fall of 1944 generally processed American prisoners according to the Geneva Convention: identification, collection, movement rearward. The captured squad would have known this in the abstract. They would also have known, in the specific and unabstract way that infantry soldiers know things, that the abstract and the actual are not always the same, and that what happened to them next depended on decisions other people were making. The hours between capture and liberation passed in the occupied part of Stolberg. The fighting at the Crossroads was still audible from wherever they were held. They could hear the rifle fire and the explosions without knowing what they meant. German forces were still pressing the position. Whether Schaefer's squad was holding or had broken was not something the captured men could know. The German soldiers guarding them would have been focused on the ongoing battle and on their own survival. What those hours felt like, the combination of exhaustion and fear and the particular uncertainty of a man who has been captured but not yet processed into the formal machinery of prisoner of war status, can be reconstructed only in outline from what infantry soldiers in similar situations recorded elsewhere. The record is silent about the specifics. What ended the uncertainty was Schaefer's counterattack moving toward them through active fire. He came from the direction of the Crossroads that had been under assault for hours. He came in the lead. The citation states it plainly, and it is not a small thing. 2 weeks after Schaefer's action at the Crossroads, the 18th Infantry Regiment produced another Medal of Honor in the same campaign. On October 8, 1944, at a hill outside Aachen that soldiers called Crucifix Hill for the large stone cross at its summit, Captain Bobby Brown of Company C, 18th Infantry, attacked 3 German concrete bunkers alone. The company had been pinned down for hours by the interlocking fire from those positions, unable to advance. Brown went up the hill by himself, under continuous fire from artillery, mortars, automatic weapons, and rifles. He reached the first bunker and knocked it out. He was wounded. He declined medical treatment and pressed on to the second bunker, put it out of action as well, and continued to the third despite being wounded again. When the 3 bunkers were done, he went out alone to reconnoiter additional enemy positions so that Company C could resume its attack. Captain Brown received the Medal of Honor. His citation describes a wounded officer who refused evacuation not once, but repeatedly over the course of a single action, continuing to advance on fortified positions alone after each wound. 2 Medal of Honor actions from the 18th Infantry Regiment in 14 days. Schaefer on September 24th at Stolberg. Brown on October 8th at Crucifix Hill. The regiment received a Presidential Unit citation for its actions during the Aachen Offensive in October of that year. A Presidential Unit citation is awarded to a unit when its collective performance meets the standard required for an individual Medal of Honor, which is the Army's own description of the distinction. It is not awarded commonly. The 18th Infantry earned it in the same period and the same campaign that produced 2 individual Medals of Honor from 2 of its companies. What accounts for this? The partial answer is that the regiment had been at war for 2 years and had developed the kind of institutional culture that extended combat produces. A very high baseline expectation of what was required, and a very specific kind of leadership at the sergeant and captain level that understood exactly what that baseline required and met it. Schaefer had 2 Silver Stars before Stolberg. Brown had combat experience going back through Normandy and the continent. These were not men who surprised themselves with what they did on those mornings in the Rhineland. They were men who had been preparing, through accumulated experience, for exactly the kind of moment that arrived. The partial answer is also that the Rhineland campaign in the fall of 1944, the Aachen Offensive in the Stolberg Corridor, and the approaches to the Rohr River was exactly the kind of fighting that demands everything a soldier has. Urban combat in German industrial towns against an enemy defending its own soil, in cold, wet autumn weather, with supply lines stretched and with the casualty rolls already long. This is the environment in which extraordinary acts happen, because the ordinary standard is not enough to survive it, and the men who excel in it tend to excel dramatically. The record of the 18th Infantry in the fall of 1944 is a record of a regiment that met that environment. It is not a famous record. The Presidential Unit citation sits in the files, the 2 Medal of Honor citations are in the Army's archives, and the names Schaefer and Brown are known in the neighborhoods they came from and not much further. That is the state of the Rhineland campaign in American memory, specific, documented, and largely uncelebrated. The Sergeant Joseph E. Schaefer Oval in Forest Park, Queens, is easy to walk past without stopping. It is a paved oval in a neighborhood park, a few stones with his name and rank, and a Truman quotation. Richmond Hill is a working-class neighborhood that takes its own history seriously in the way that working-class neighborhoods do. Not loudly, not with large gestures, but with the kind of persistence that puts a man's name on a street and keeps his memorial maintained and sends people to the cemetery on the right dates. That is how most of the men who held Crossroads in the Rhineland are remembered, locally, specifically, by the communities they came from and returned to. Joseph Schaefer came back to Richmond Hill after the war and after Korea and lived there for 30 years. He was not famous in the wider sense. He was known in the neighborhood. He was the man who had done what the stones in Forest Park say he did. That was enough, in Richmond Hill, to be remembered. It should be enough everywhere. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.